Hello, everybody. As always, we'll take just a moment or two and let everybody sign in. Again, my name is Hart Brown, Senior Vice President here with R3 Continuum. Looking forward to answering your questions on COVID-19 and what it means for all of us. So we'll give it just a moment or so as everybody begins to log in. All right, we're already starting to see some join. Welcome. Hi, Susie. Hi, Steve. Great to see you all. Thanks for joining. We're having a few more log in. We'll give it just another moment or so while everybody's logging in. Don't forget to ask your questions as we go through the presentation, a little bit about where we are today. You can ask those in the chat function, or if you prefer after the event, you can always go to r3c.com. Thank you, Lauren, for the kind words and for joining. We're still getting a few more logging in. Give it just another minute or so. All right. Okay, let's get started. So thank you all again for joining. My name again is Hart Brown with R3 Continuum, and looking forward to answering your questions on COVID-19, where we are today, and what we're likely to see here in the near future. So let's get started. Again, for those of you that just joined, don't hesitate to ask your questions in the chat function. We'll answer as many as we can today. But to get us started, just to give us an idea of where we are and what's going on with some of the numbers. So if you've been watching the numbers, you've seen over the past few weeks, we really hit what appeared to be a second peak, roughly 65, sometimes 70,000 cases a day. That was troubling. It did appear that we leveled off, at least for the moment. And in fact, we've seen over the past few days a pretty significant dip in the cases. We're now in the neighborhood of 54,000 cases a day on a 7-day moving average. That's a pretty good dip for a short period of time. The question really is, why are we seeing that dip? Now, we all want to see the dip. We want those numbers to go to zero as quickly as possible. But is there something in those numbers that we're not necessarily seeing or able to analyze completely as to what's going on? And I'll tell you that the numbers are a little bit confusing right now. We've seen a dip in positive cases. That's a good thing. We've also seen roughly at the same over the same period of time, the positivity rate for those case numbers are roughly the same. They haven't changed. And so what we have seen is a decrease in the number of total tests. So we were averaging roughly 800,000, 900,000 tests per day. Now we're starting to see in the 650,000 cases or tests per day. Now that's a big jump. That's a big difference, with the positivity rate roughly being the same during that same period of time. So what's the difference? Why would we see a drop in tests with the positivity rate being the same? And that's a question we don't necessarily have the answer to. It would be much clearer if we saw that positivity rate starting to go down and the total number of tests go down. That would make sense. From a narrative perspective, you would say, well, there's less people feeling ill, therefore there's less people going to get tests, and because of that, we're seeing lower case numbers. It doesn't necessarily appear that that story fits the data. So some of the things, when you look state by state from a testing perspective, we have seen specifically across the East Coast, the testing rates day over day have dropped. Now, don't necessarily know the reason for that, and there's questions that are being posed as to why we're seeing potentially less testing in places like Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, all the way through that area. One of the issues that has come up is, did the hurricane, we had Hurricane Isaias come up the East Coast, did the hurricane in fact cause potentially lower numbers of people to go and get tested? And therefore we have cases that haven't necessarily been positively identified. We don't necessarily know the answer to that question. We're waiting to see is this a real event that the numbers are in fact going down at a significant rate, which we want to see, or can this be explained potentially as some aspect of the data that we're not really getting a full story with. Now, the challenge with that is, if it is something related to potentially Isaias or something along those lines that's causing a disruption in the number of tests, we can look forward over the next few months and anticipate that to occur over and over again. We're heading into the worst part of hurricane season. We got 90% of hurricane season left right now, and based on all of the weather patterns and everything we're starting to see, roughly midweek to the end of this week, the weather patterns shift to become much more favorable to hurricanes, and unfortunately we could end up running out of hurricane names this year due to the sheer number of hurricanes and named storms that may actually occur. So there could be some interaction between those two. It'll take another week or so to try and figure out, is the data we're seeing actually real, or is it some aspect of the testing process that we need to figure out? So that gives us a sense for where we are at the moment. One of the big questions that keeps being asked, and was asked yesterday again, is, Hart, when is this going to be over? Wonderful question that has a really, really difficult answer. And the answer is in multiple parts. So the first part of that answer is from an acute perspective, which is where we sit today. And by acute, from a crisis management perspective, we're playing catch up. The virus in this perspective is always ahead of us. That process is going to continue over and over and over, day over day, until we have the vaccine. A vaccine that can be produced at scale, delivered at scale, and accepted, meaning people are going to take the vaccine at scale. Now, the challenge with all of that, regardless of what we hear potentially in what I would call in many cases political theater, we may get some announcements, we may get some positive data that a vaccine is in the works, that it's close. The reality is, for any of these right now, if you're looking at some of the numbers behind the scenes, you need roughly 30,000 people to test each vaccine over a period of time before we identify that it is potentially effective. And effective to what level? The reality now is we only have a few thousand people testing each of the current vaccines that are ahead of the game in clinical trials. And it's going to take time. It's going to take time to build those numbers up, and then it takes time to get enough information over a period of time to associate that vaccine with some level of efficacy. So best case right now, we're still looking at sometime potentially early next year, potentially in the April timeframe, where we may in fact have a vaccine that is produced in quantities that make sense, and potentially being able to deliver those at mass across potentially the United States, other countries. Now, the second challenge with that is how many people take that vaccine. Well, what does that mean? So the answer to the question from an acute perspective, how long are we potentially in our homes? That's likely to be April or sometime in the summer of next year, before really we get more and more comfortable with trying to get back to potentially normal. Then the next question is, how long are we in this sort of in-between time frame where the virus still exists, it's still going to circulate, we have a vaccine that may not be 100% effective, and it may not be taken, it may not be accepted by 100% of the population. So how long is it going to take us to really impact the virus and start to create this, reduce the uncertainty at least? That's likely to be years. Unfortunately, we're looking at potentially 3 years or more, depending on how many people take the vaccine, how many people, how effective is the vaccine. It's not going to be over in one day, the day that the vaccine is announced and available, unfortunately. So we're going to have this intermediate time frame before potentially the virus is really on its heels and potentially is beaten. And that for a period of time, that may be a number of years after that, if we're having to take a vaccine each year or some booster. But that's the general time frame that we're dealing with. Now, what does that mean? Because the next question really comes in is, well, if it's going to be April or summer of next year, and then based on that, 3 years, maybe a little bit more, to create enough immunity in the global population to make sense, and then we have a time frame after that, is what behaviors are changing now, and what behaviors are likely to change in the future, potentially permanently. What's going to be different? And that always goes along with the questions, when is this going to be over? Behaviors are likely to change because of this forever. And the easiest way to go back in time and try and associate what we're going through now to the Spanish influenza, which was the last big event similar to this in 1918, some of the things that changed forever are still in place today, interestingly enough. So what are some of those things that we can take from the 1918 event, as well as what we're going through now, and establish what's like some of the things that are likely to change? First is the nature of the workplace. We're already seeing numbers in the range of 10% to 20% of space that is likely to be reduced on a workplace basis. Most employers are looking at how to potentially reduce the square footage because more and more people are able to work from home successfully. So we're likely to see real estate begin to shift. Now, you can't necessarily eliminate real estate. You're just going to pick it up from one place and move it to the other. So if we're going to remove it from the office environment, we're going to replace that with space in the home environment. And so we're starting to see that real estate shift occur in more and more individuals and families thinking about what does that mean for them moving forward from a home environment. Roughly 30%, based on the numbers we see now, roughly 30% of families in the United States are considering buying another home, a different home that allows them greater flexibility to be at home more often than going potentially to the office. We take that back to 1918, and we saw some of the same kinds of things, although in a different way. So what we saw in 1918 from an architecture perspective, from an interior design perspective, we saw choices and behaviors changing. So some of the things we saw in 1918, we saw the idea of subway tiles find its way into the homes. It was in hospitals and others, sort of white subway tiles. And the idea was if you can put that in your home, then you can see dirt, dust, and anything else that would need to be cleaned. That's something that continues even today. Some of the other interesting things, we used to put clothes during that time frame in armoires, a big bulky type of furniture. It was right about that same time frame that they started putting closets into homes to create just a little bit more space and take bulky furniture out, which is harder to clean. We also see things that change during that time frame with ideas of powder rooms for guests that may come into the house. You just didn't want them into the core family space from the idea of the disease. So we saw a number of things play out in the home during that time frame, and we're likely to see some of those same kinds of things, the ideas, are likely to be persistent well after COVID-19, certainly after April of next year or into the summer of next year. And so what are some of the things that are going on in homes and personal real estate? And we're starting to see more and more individuals, more and more families, more and more people start to rethink the home environment or want specific types of office and workspace, which hasn't necessarily been needed to the extent it has now. We're also starting to see that more and more individuals are thinking outside. Now, this occurred in 1918 as well, but we're starting to see more and more families think, well, I may need a little bit more space, or I may need a pool, I may need something to have a little bit of recreation activity during this time frame that this virus is going to continue to circulate for the next few years. In 1918, one of the interesting things was really the establishing of patios. Patios became much more popular after the influenza pandemic simply because it's easier to deal with those individuals that may be sick, specifically outside. And they created sleeping patios where you could sleep outside for a period of time, weather permitting, especially if you were sick. Then you weren't bringing it necessarily into the home. So we're starting to see those same kinds of ideas. They were persistent from 1918. These kinds of behavioral changes are likely to be persistent well after where we are today. So to go back to the original question, when is this going to be over? There's the aspects of the virus, when that's going to be over in the timeline there, but there's also this timeline of behavior, and ultimately that some of these behaviors may be persistent for forever. So I know that's a tough way to answer that question, but this is a situation, we haven't seen it in 100 years. We hopefully won't see it for another 100 years or more if we ever have to go through this again. But it's not likely that these kinds of things are simply going to resolve themselves overnight. It's going to take time for us as a society to find our way through this, through the pandemic. So some interesting things there. Another question that we get from time and time again: when is is there going to be a second wave, and when will that occur? Now, something interesting with when you look at waves, certainly in this context, if you take it in the context of influenza, the influenza year over year, a bad year of flu roughly lasts 20 to 24 weeks through that season. And then we see a bit of a break, and then it starts again, the potential next season. This has been a little bit different. In some cases, that 20 to 24 week cycle in some countries, we've seen a bit of that play out. But we are starting to see, based on the potential data and what happens over the next few weeks, if the data begins to tail off, we could start to say potentially we are looking at the beginning of the end of the first wave. The second wave will likely start, and most people are predicting the second wave will likely start about the same time as flu season if we don't change anything that we're doing now, meaning we're all out and about, we're all doing the kinds of things that we have typically done. If that does not change, then the flu season typically starts the last week or so of September. So hopefully the numbers go down as much as they possibly can, and then we potentially have a little bit of a break, a little bit of a lull in best case, and then all of a sudden we see another increase beginning roughly the end of September. That would technically be, if you discussed it on the level of an influenza, that would technically become now the potential second wave. Now, the question will be is, do we actually get a significant enough drop to see it, or our case numbers stay unfortunately quite high and become an issue for us moving forward? We don't know the answer to that, but that gives us a potential sense. Most people are anticipating the second wave here in the United States to occur end of September, sometime in October, and then continue through the first of the year. All right, let's get to the next question. You stated that this may last 3+ years, but will we be able to get to better manage the virus and have more ability to do things? It's a great question. Two schools of thought on that. We in the United States have taken a very specific approach to trying to manage this. Other countries, and there's been some successes. New Zealand is right now being focused pretty significantly on it as a potential success case. The problem here in the US and what we've seen in other countries have economically shut down faster and for a longer period of time than we did here in the US. Now, the reality is they were able to get those case numbers lower, and when they reopened, the reopening process for them was much faster economically, as well as getting back to some sense of normalcy. So this idea of a hard lockdown for a longer period of time actually has been positive, both from an economic perspective as well as from a human perspective. Here in the US, we really don't have the tolerance for that. Because of that, we didn't have the significant level of lockdown, and we opened a bit faster than everybody else. So this question of will we be able to manage a little bit better, pessimistically, if we don't change behavior, number one, it's going to be incredibly difficult. We will continue to see the virus cycling, and by behavior meaning the simple things right now, distancing and mask, and making sure you reduce the number of total interactions as much as you possibly can. That does not appear to be working to the extent that most people believe it should. So if we don't change behavior, I don't think we're going to be able to significantly manage this. The one caveat to that would be if we do get some level of therapeutic treatment, that if you do get sick, there's a mechanism you can go and take some medicine and in fact start to get better faster. That would allow us to manage this a little bit better. But if you're just looking at the ability to manage this from a human behavior perspective, unfortunately here in the US right now, we're just not in a position where, from a society perspective, we're ready and willing to do what it takes to manage it. And that's a sad statement. It's a tough statement, but it's better to be prepared for what's likely to happen in the next 3 to 5 years if we don't change that behavior, or if we don't get a therapeutic that makes sense. All right, so we get another question. We get a lot of questions continuing about schools. Interesting thing about schools this week is we see a pairing of stresses. And by that I mean there's a direct connect to the potential office level of stress and school level of stress, which makes complete sense for many families. If the children aren't able to go to school, it's going to be very difficult for me to go to the office. So we have a really interesting dynamic right now from a stress level and intensity that many families are going through. We've had a few states that have started to begin to open in-person classes. Now that is in and of itself a bit of a challenge. How do you get everybody in safely and make sure that they're safe throughout the day? Georgia was really one of the first that opened on a larger scale, and if for those of you following the news, we're seeing more and more cases pop up, unfortunately, in Georgia in schools, both with staff as well as with children. Now, we've seen over the past few months, we saw that we were referencing in the early stages of COVID-19 that the idea was let's protect the most vulnerable of the population, which at that point in time, we were seeing more cases in older individuals. Once we started to control that and we began to open, specifically we started to see more restaurants, more bars, things starting to open up, and we saw the shift in demographics from cases from some of the most vulnerable aspects of our population, which we were now protecting, into younger individuals, which we thought had a greater degree of immunity. And by that, I'm talking now about anywhere from 20 to 40, 45 years old, we thought had a greater degree of resistance to this. And then we saw more cases. The more cases in a given demographic or population, the more of those numbers of those cases are going to get serious. Now, here's the challenge with schools opening. We have not put, over a period of time, now, the past few months, most children have not necessarily been out and about in the same way that they normally would be during that time frame. And so many children are not being tested. They're not necessarily a focal point of the overall crisis response right now. Once we open schools and we bring a lot of children potentially into the schools, we're likely to see the case numbers and the demographics of current cases shift again to become younger. And in fact, as some of you may know, the last 2 weeks of July, we saw roughly 100,000 children in the United States test positive. If you take the total number of cases during that time frame and you take the number of children, and by children I'm saying 14 years and younger on the current studies, roughly 11% of all new cases during that time frame were ages 14 and younger. That's a pretty significant jump in the total demographics of children becoming infected with COVID-19 and being identified as having COVID-19. As we see more and more schools open, as we have more and more children interacting in large numbers, in the same way we saw young adults interacting in large numbers at parties and bars and others, we are likely to see that transmission go through the younger population as well in a greater percentage. There's just no way potentially to deal with that level of transmission when you're putting large groups of people together. So that is a challenge. We're also seeing with children some of the new studies talking about viral load, which really is how much virus is concentrated in the nose and throat of a young child. And in many cases, those numbers are higher than even in many adults that are being tested. So it is highly likely that, unfortunately, children can transmit through speaking, sneezing, whatever it may be, because of that higher degree of virus in their nose and throat. We don't have all the answers as to why we see differences in the children and adults at this point in time, but we do see that virus present in the nose and throat of those children. So we have Florida opening up over the next week or so. We'll have more, unfortunately, information coming out, likely of Florida, if we do have positive cases and what's happening there, to help inform, unfortunately, everybody else that's still struggling with this idea of, is it safe? Should we have children in schools in large numbers or not? Or how do we manage this overall? What we've seen, for those of you that have school-age children that are thinking through this, or for those of you even in the workplace that have parents in the workplace as well, in Georgia they already have over 500 people in the school world, both students and faculty, now in quarantine because of the potential for exposure to COVID-19 in the school system itself based on those positive tests. So here's the challenge. Even if we do have children in school in relative large numbers in person, as soon as we start seeing positive tests, you're going to start to see larger and larger groups of individuals that have to go into quarantine for a period of time. It will be heavily disruptive for the next few months, without a doubt, as we're continuing to deal with this. So it's a little bit of an update, unfortunately, with schools, but we will see potentially more transmission in the younger population. Another question that we get quite a bit is on sports and what's happening in the world of sports and what lessons can we take away certainly from that. So a few things that have happened over the past few days that are relatively significant, I know to many of you out there that are college football fans specifically, but we're starting to see entire conferences unfortunately have to make the decision to potentially shut down, at least postpone or cancel this college football season. And so the latest news as of a few hours ago, it has not been fully confirmed, but the Big Ten is expected to make an announcement as early as tomorrow. And interestingly enough, if the rumors happen to be true, Some of the rumors were saying that in the vote, whether they should move forward or not move forward, it was roughly 12 that were not in favor of moving forward and roughly 2 in favor of moving forward. So the vote wasn't, if that played out to be true, which has not been confirmed, but if it played out to be true, then really the vote was not necessarily even that close, that the decision was pretty much pretty clear that they weren't going to be able to play this season. I know that's tough for a lot of people to hear. I know that's tough for a lot of athletes to hear. It is a difficult situation, but from the school's perspective, what you're starting to see more and more of, there are 2 aspects. One, this idea of traveling city by city is just not viable right now, unfortunately, and you're seeing that play out in baseball. Baseball now has a situation where you have the Cardinals, I believe, that have to play 55 games in 47 days, something along those lines, because they keep having positive tests, which delays their schedule, and then the schedule just starts, unfortunately, the domino effect, and then they have to play way too many games than really they should. And if they have one more disruption, if it rains, if they have a problem, you can almost get to a point where that season's going to have to be canceled. They're just not going to be able to play to a championship. Doesn't really make sense. And so the schools are having to go through that same process. Can we actually get through an entire season and get to a championship? In many cases, the answer to that question is probably not. Then the next question that the schools are trying to deal with, a lot of it is protecting the players. There's players that are getting more and more vocal. They don't want to risk their long-term health by playing, and the university doesn't want to take that liability on either. A lot of the discussions right now with the athletes is very much around the heart, in that the idea that COVID-19 has this potential, which is not fully well understood yet from a testing perspective, but it does have the ability to attack certain parts of the heart. Because of that, you could in fact see or have the potential for a long-term impact on your overall health and well-being going forward as an athlete. And so the universities don't have a mechanism to understand that liability, as well as the athletes don't want to be put into a situation where they're at increased risk simply by being on the field. So it is an incredibly difficult challenge. If the Big Ten does make the announcement, as everybody expects probably tomorrow, you're likely to see other large conferences having to fall in line. The problem is, once you set the standard of it's not viable from a health and safety perspective, it becomes very, very difficult for another conference to step forward and say, well, it may not be viable for you from a health and safety perspective, but we can actually do it from a health and safety perspective. The liability and the challenges that conference would encounter by trying to move forward with the season would be pretty significant if anything were to go wrong. So more than likely you'll see, unfortunately, the others starting to make a big decision as well. The last thing about universities that I would add to that, we're starting to see, not just from an athletic perspective, but we're starting to see more and more decisions being made from a health perspective with students as well. So some of the things that are playing out in the news, for those of you that are watching this, but we've seen even at places like Harvard, roughly 20% of the incoming freshman class have deferred for a year. The idea being it's just not viable for them from a health and safety perspective to go to school. And we're seeing that playing out potentially at other universities as well. So the entire university dynamic, both from a sporting perspective as well as from a campus life perspective, is likely to change for certainly a period of time, with less students potentially engaged and not as much, if any, athletic activity engaged. There are a few universities that could potentially try and do something on their own just to fill the gap. You could have exhibition games. You could see that potentially with some universities if they were able to create a bit of a bubble just to generate some activity. But the reality is, the big benefactor of college sports, if it does not move forward, is really the NFL. The National Football League now has a situation where there's a lot of television time that needs to be filled by all of the networks. And so rather than having Saturday be the day for college football and potentially Sunday being professional football, you're likely to see the Professional Football League actually change their schedule to fill in some of that gap and recover some of the revenue and television time that they potentially are looking for based on the number of people that are likely to be in the stands, which is very, very minimal. So you're likely to see some things play out over the next few weeks based on those schedules. So a lot of things happening in the world of sports, a lot of things happening with universities, and unfortunately, what most people are hoping for is things like college football is not likely to occur, certainly in the near term. All right, so with that ends all of our questions here today. Certainly appreciate you all watching. Don't forget, if you have any questions, you can always ask them here in the chat function. You can go to r3c.com, ask them on our website. Again, this is Hart Brown, Senior Vice President here with R3 Continuum. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.